this is kind of interesting here. These two plots, and I'm not going to talk about the species here because I've got them repeated down there. I'll talk about them down there. But these two strips, when we pulled in here with the drill, we dumped this in because this is what I intended to plant first. And then I realized my drill was set to 2+ inches deep. And those 750 drills are a little hard to change the depth on. So I knew I needed it that deep to plant my large seeded stuff. So we went ahead and just planted this set of small seeded things out at 2 inches deep. And you know, it's probably not as good a stand as down there where I had it set, you know, about 3/4 of an inch. But I wanted to show you that even though this stuff got planted 2 inches deep, you can still get quite a bit of it to come up even from that depth with these small seeds. And particularly when they're in a mix, you know, we get people ask all the time, how deep can I plant these small seeds? Well, the answer is you can plant them relatively deep, get them down to some moisture, and still get a pretty good stand to come up, especially in a mix. Now, none of these mixes, these are all kind of kept separate between small seeds and large seeds, just so we can kind of look at things a little bit better. But I just wanted to show you that you can plant these things a little deep sometimes and you'll still get a pretty good stand. We'll talk about these species later on when we get over here to this side. These two strips here are 40 4-H peas, oats, and Baldy safflower. And again, we were kind of doing an experiment here that we're really not going to be able to get much data collection off of because of the poor stand. But this side was treated with a seed treatment that we call biazo. And what that is, it's a combination of several organisms, the two main ones being Zotobacter and Azospirillum. And those are two bacterias that can take atmospheric nitrogen. They can convert it to plant available nitrogen just like rhizobia do, but they don't have to associate with a specific legume. They can trade that nitrogen to any plant, grass plants in particular, in exchange for the carbon that the grass plant will provide. And so you would say, well, how comes we're not using that on all of our corn and never fertilizing corn? And the answer is these guys are only going to produce 20 to 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So it would never be enough to grow a really good corn crop, but think what 30 or 40 pounds of nitrogen would do for a cover crop or for a forage crop. Sometimes that's all you really need to make a pretty significant difference. Now, we don't really see that much of a difference here, but I don't think I was in a nitrogen deficient stage. We did not apply any fertilizer here, but at the same point, we didn't harvest a crop off this last year either. So essentially, even though we had cover crop plots out here, it was essentially kind of like a summer fallow. So I probably had enough mineralized nitrogen, you know, to where things aren't looking nitrogen stressed. So again, that's a product that we're evaluating. It's relatively inexpensive. A full rate of this is only going to be about $3 an acre. And so if we can, even if we can produce, you know, 15 or 20 pounds of nitrogen through those organisms for $3 an acre, it's definitely going to be worth it. It's something new that we're trying this year, so you know, stay tuned. We're going to try to have some better situations than this to collect some data on. One of the things I want to point out on this particular plot, looking at these species, is this safflower. I don't know if you're familiar with safflower plants at all, but normal safflower is a very spiny, almost thistle-like plant, especially as it gets mature. This is a particular variety called Baldy. It was developed by Montana State several years ago as a spineless safflower. So these leaves are going to be much like a sunflower leaf in that they don't have any spines at all. So even at full maturity, you could grab this safflower with your bare hands and not come away with a handful of thorns. You cannot do that with any other safflower variety. Safflower is grown for the seed head. It produces an oil seed just like sunflowers do. You've probably all cooked with safflower oil, and that's what it's coming from. We think that this is going to be a good grazing plant because of its spineless nature, and so we purchased the rights for this. So the only place you can legally buy Baldy safflower is from us because we own the variety now, and we think it's going to be a pretty good one. We've been trying to get our seed production acres up. We've got a decent supply this year, and we'll have more coming on in the future. So that's the Baldy safflower. We'll look at the other types of safflower over here. It's still vegetative, so it's not too thistly or thorny yet, but it will get there. So Baldy safflower is one that we think is going to be a really good one for grazing mixes. This is the regular safflower, and again, if you feel it, I mean, you can still handle it because it's still fairly immature, but if you look at the plant, you can start to see where it's starting to form all those little thorns and all those thistle barbs. They'll be coming on pretty strong. I've had guys from the Dakotas where they grow a fair amount of safflower have actually told me they, you know, sometimes if guys are calving kind of out in the open, they will plant a border of safflower around a calving pasture, because when this safflower gets mature and you've got, you know, 30 or 40 feet of it, they said a coyote won't run through that. I mean, it's that prickly. So the Baldy plant is going to be a nice one to use for some of those things. Another plant I want to point out here is this chickling vetch. Chickling vetch is a kind of a unique legume plant in the fact that there's no commercial value to the seed as far as a livestock feed, because this seed actually contains neurotoxins. So you cannot feed this to animals or you'll kill them. So you don't want to do that. So the value of the seed is to plant. It was developed specifically as a cover crop, as a green manure cover crop, because it's a very, very good nodulating plant, and the number of different root exudates that this plant puts out into the soil is higher than just about any other type of crop. And we'll try to carefully hand this around. You can really see the nodules coming on, even though this plant isn't huge. It's got really good nodulation, so it's one of the best nitrogen fixers that you can plant in the spring. As a vetch plant, it's very unique in that it has characteristics of vetches. It has characteristics of peas and also some grass type characteristics. And sometimes if you Google this, you'll see this labeled as grassy pea vine. And because it's got characteristics of all of those, and if you've ever seen the seed, you would swear that I was selling you a handful of road gravel, because it's a kind of angular seed. It's different shapes, it's different sizes, it's different colors. Just looks like a handful of gravel, but it's a really good nitrogen fixing green manure cover crop. Very popular amongst the organic folks because of its ability to produce nitrogen. And then we also want to look at fava beans. Let's find a good fava bean here. Fava beans are another spring legume crop that we've been looking at fairly closely the last several years. Fava beans have a great root system, and it's the only true bean plant that will tolerate cold, wet soils. All the other beans need to have much warmer soil, so this is the only bean plant that you could plant either in the spring or later in the summer and get much fall growth on, but mainly it would be a spring planted crop. It's got a great root system, and the fact that it not only has a pretty decent taproot, but it also has pretty nice lateral roots. And so you can see how that root system is developing not only down, but it's got really extensive lateral root systems. And there's some nodules on this. This isn't as good as I had one for an earlier group that had really good nodulation out on these side roots. Fava beans are going to grow well in those cool soils. As it gets hotter, these things are going to kind of speed up through their life cycle a little quicker. So I don't know that we could grow these for seed production here very well. We get too hot too soon. Up in North Dakota, where they can grow them pretty well, these things will get 5 to 6 feet tall, and they may yield 80 bushel on fava beans. Down here, you know, we've never tried harvesting them for seed, but I've never seen these get more than about 3 feet tall down here. And it's just a matter of the heat coming on too quick for a cool season plant. But you can see they've got nice, you know, white flowers. They're a pretty little flower. The biggest thing against the fava beans over the years has been seed size. Because these are used in the human consumption market, anything for human consumption, they try to breed larger seeds because they're easier to process. For the cover crop market, we want as small of seeds as possible, so that when I sell you a pound of seed, you're getting as many plants per acre as possible. So these are small seeded fava beans, but they're still about 1,500 to 1,600 seeds per pound, which is about what corn is. If you just think of the size of corn kernels, that's about what these are, and that's small. Large seeded fava beans can be 500 to 600 seeds per pound, which is essentially like a lima bean. So those big ones don't work in mixes very well at all. These smaller seeded ones tend to go through a drill and work much better. So, and again, we've gotten the price down on fava beans because we found some better growers growing these small seeded varieties. So I think right now fava beans are, you know, like 50 cents a pound or something, where a couple years ago they were 75 or 80 cents. So that's something, if we can continue to get that seed size bred down, get that price dropped a little bit, we'll push these fava beans in these spring mixes even more. Any questions on those? And there's a lot of things here that we don't have time to necessarily look at, but some of them are just pretty common things like oats and spring triticale, and I'm not necessarily going to highlight those. This mix right here, I believe this is the one that has the Admiral peas, Elbon rye, and sunflowers. This is kind of interesting because normally Elbon rye is a winter cereal, and it normally wouldn't give you a lot of growth without going through a vernalization period. But this looks pretty darn good so far. We'll continue to watch this, and we don't know if it got cold enough in April to where this plant actually vernalized, and so it's going to just give us the full, you know, it'll get 4 or 5 feet tall like rye normally does, like what you saw over there. Or if this particular variety of rye doesn't have to vernalize to give you quite a bit of growth. This is a very growthy rye in the fall, so we may be seeing that, but nonetheless, I guess what this shows me is that we could plant some spring planted rye like this and still get some pretty decent grazing. I don't know, that's something we're still looking at and trying to determine, so we'll watch this and let it grow and see. And then, of course, sunflowers. We like sunflowers a lot. We use a lot of sunflowers in our mixes. Sunflowers are the cheapest taproots you can put in the ground, you know, for 45 cents a pound, and you only need a pound or two an acre, and you can almost never dig up a sunflower in moist soil without finding worms. Worms love to congregate around these big sunflower roots, and so unless somebody absolutely says, no, I don't want sunflowers because I had to cut them when I was a kid, we almost always put sunflowers in our warm season mixes because they're cheap and they've got a great taproot, and at this stage these would graze very well. The ladybug hanging out right on that one there too. Got a ladybug and a worm just on this one. So from a biology standpoint they're great, from an economic standpoint they're cheap, from a taproot standpoint they're very good, and like I say, at this stage cattle would graze these quite well. They'll eat them vegetatively like this. As they get a little older, the sunflowers, as they get a little more mature, they would start just picking the leaves off. And if this is allowed to go to head, these are black oil seed sunflowers, so if this makes a head, the seeds in that have 40% oil content, and that's a great energy source for the winter. So we'll use a lot of sunflowers in mixes where you want to plant them in the summer, but you're not grazing until the winter, because these things will get completely mature, so there's not a lot of forage value in the vegetation, but there's going to be good forage value in those heads, because they'll eat those oil seeds all winter long, and it's a great source of energy for them. And you'll also see a lot of birds and a lot of mice and crickets and everything else cleaning up the volunteer seeds from your sunflowers.
Real quick, Keith, there's been some discussion between colleagues and myself. How many of those seeds are going to germinate following year?
Well, you know, I've always said not many, but we had a field that did have some volunteer this spring. That's the first time I've really seen that. Probably depends a little bit upon how much biological activity, because I guarantee you at 40% oil, if you're a mouse or a cricket or a beetle of any kind and you find something that's 40% oil, that's a big deal for you. You're going to take that. So I would say the more biologically active your environment is, the less you will see. And it makes a big difference if you're grazing cat, because like I said, cattle, if they can find them, they'll eat them. You know, they'll eat those heads and consume that. So there probably is going to be some, these, and again, these are not wild ditch type sunflowers that, you know, are hard to kill. These spray out pretty easily too. So even if you do have some volunteers, it's not going to be like trying to control just a common sunflower that grows in your ditches and, you know, has the tiny little head, because those sunflowers have almost no oil in those seeds, and so those don't get consumed by the mice and the crickets and the bugs and everything, whereas these high oil seed ones do tend to. So you'll see some, but I don't, you know, we've never seen it be an issue.
If you grade those early in the year, do you ever have enough seed production to harvest it in the fall?
If you graze the sunflower early in the year, it's probably not going to grow back well enough to have good seed production. So you need to either do one or the other. And the other thing is, these are, I would not plant these sunflowers here for seed production, because these are not a hybrid. These would be the second generation out of a hybrid. And so that's why they're cheap, is because we can plant a hybrid, harvest it, sell you that seed for, you know, 45 cents a pound. If I was going to plant a field for seed production, that seed's going to cost me $7 or $8 a pound, because it's a male-female cross to get that F1 hybrid, which is what you plant, because it's going to have much larger heads and much better seed production. And you're only planting about 4 pounds an acre at a full rate. And so, you know, if you want to do production on them, you want to spend the money and buy the hybrid. As a cover crop, you know, the cheap ones are fine, because you don't need to get 2,500 pounds of sunflowers per acre. Colton, any comments on sunflowers?
You're doing great, boss.
Been doing great, thanks. All right, let's move on. These next set of plots here are what we call our milpa garden mixes. Milpa, M-I-L-P-A, is a term that I read in a book. There's a book called 1491, and this guy basically just wrote a history of the Mesoamerican or Native American cultures, that what it would have looked like before Columbus came. And one of the terms that he described in there that the Mesoamerican, you know, Native American Indians would have been using was a milpa garden or a milpa field. And it simply was a field where they would have 6, 8, 10, 12 different vegetable species all growing together, and then they would just harvest whatever grew for food production. So, you know, kind of like the Three Sisters concept of corn, beans, and squash, but with lots of other things added as well. So we kind of adopted that term, and these aren't, if you look at this and go, man, we could harvest a lot of food off this, you probably don't think that necessarily. The cool season ones aren't nearly as good, because what we're trying to do with this is we've established a program where if you want to plant an acre or two of these garden type mixes, if you have an agreement or an arrangement with a food bank or a food pantry or something like that, we'll give you the seed, and then it's up to you to try to get it harvested and get it to the food bank to get it to the people that need it. Well, with these leaf type crops, you would have to be out here every 2 or 3 days kind of harvesting these leaf greens to really make it worthwhile, and that just doesn't work out for most people. So we put these out here just to kind of look at and evaluate, but the most popular way of doing this would be to plant the warm season varieties, which have a lot of squash, pumpkins, melons, cucumbers, cowpeas, okra, things like that. And those you only have to harvest several times throughout the year instead of several times a week to really do it right. And so we've had some pretty good success. They've harvested quite a few pounds of produce down in Oklahoma and gotten it to the local food banks. So you can kind of walk through here and look. There's just a variety of different things. There's some beets growing out here. There's some different kinds of lettuce, you know, and it looks a lot like the lettuce that you'd buy at a store. So, you know, we're experimenting. There's supposed to be spinach in here, but I can't find any spinach, so I don't know if that seed wasn't any good. But if you look, there's some beets out here. There's turnips, there's kale, there's collards. So a lot of this would just simply be harvesting the greens. And if we had a bottle of ranch dressing or something here, we could all go to town and have a little appetizer, first course here. But again, the milpa garden concept is much more effective when we plant the warm season. And we'll plant that here later this week. All that you see sprayed out behind us and that rye back there, we're gonna roll that rye down and plant those warm season garden mixes back there and see if we can't get a fair amount of that viney type vegetable crop production. I want to show you this because I actually did do this on purpose. Some of these mess ups out here I wasn't even trying to do, but this one I actually did on purpose. Basically where I'm standing here is the exact same mix as what's over here. I just doubled the seeding rate of this versus that. And I wanted to show you that because we have seen this before. When you plant brassicas too thick, they will not do nearly as well. So I would say that this plot over here is probably 6 to 8 pounds of brassicas per acre. This is probably 12 to 16 pounds over here. Way too thick. Brassicas accumulate sulfur and nitrogen very, very well, and they need that to grow. And over there, they're getting adequate amounts. Over here, you see them yellow and they're stunted and they're small, mainly because they're just starving each other for those nutrients. And they're just too thick, too close together to be very productive. So you can certainly overdo it when it comes to planting some of these seeds, particularly these small seeded things. You have to be careful that you don't get them too thick or you'll end up with this and not that.
In grazing situations, if you possibly run into higher nitrate accumulations in the higher seed range because they are brassicas?
It could be, although they're going to have less nitrogen for each plant. So I don't know. I mean, I should probably send the interns out here and have them, you know, we did not apply any nitrogen to this at all.
Okay.
But this also was just cover crop plots last year, so nothing was harvested. So essentially this is almost like it was summer fallowed because there was no nutrients exported. So whatever is mineralized is kind of just cycling through. So I suspect they're not going to be high nitrates here, but had we put 50 pounds of fertilizer on, it sure could be getting hot. Yes.
You probably said, did you sow all this or plant all this at the same time?
Everything here is planted April 12th. Yes.
And some of this vetch was in there too, or that's volunteer?
The vetch is volunteer from the plots last year.
Okay.
Yep. Now there's some vetch down here that was part of a mix, but like where you see vetch sporadically around here, that was just volunteer that came up last fall. That's why it's so much bigger. These two plots right here are the same ones that I started with down there that I planted too deep. And so I want to talk a little bit about the actual species that are in here now. This one I wanted to kind of demonstrate and show the different kinds of mustard. Mustard, well, brassicas have 3 different ways that they go reproductive. Crops like mustard, and to some extent the Ethiopian African cabbage over here, but mustards in particular, they will go reproductive when they've accumulated a certain number of growing degree days. So I can plant mustard in April, May, June, all the way through August, September. When they accumulate enough growing degree days, they're going to bloom. They don't care when they're planted, it's just how many growing degree days can they accumulate. This yellow mustard will start blooming in 30 to 40 days. The brown mustards, which look more like that, are going to be about 2 weeks later. And then there's another type of mustard in here, the Florida broadleaf mustard. It stays vegetative for a much, much longer period of time. This may take another 6 to 8 weeks before this blooms. This mustard is what they actually grow in gardens, and they harvest mustard greens. You ever heard anybody talk about eating mustard greens? This is the exact same plant that they're using for that. So in a pollinator, if you want something to bloom, mustards are a good way of getting some of those early blossoms, but we can stretch that out as well. And then over here, anything that's blooming white is a radish. Radishes have a different mechanism that triggers reproduction. They simply are looking at, are days getting longer or are days getting shorter? If the days are getting longer, these radishes are going to bloom. They're going to bolt and bloom and try to make seed. If the days are getting shorter, so if these were planted in July and August, they would start forming that big radish taproot that you see in all the time. So all the white blossoms are radishes. All of the yellow blossoms here are mustards. But there is another type of radish here. This is called graza radish. And this graza radish will grow vegetative far, far longer than what the nitro radish does. So if you want a spring planted radish to graze, you need this one and not the nitro radish, because these will eventually bolt, but it may be another 5 or 6 weeks before we see these start to flower. So they'll grow for a far longer period of time. They cost twice as much because production, it's owned by one company and they don't produce very much seed. So the production, the supply is pretty tightly held. But if you want a spring planted radish that doesn't bolt, this is the one to go with. Lots of other things in here. I've got flax in a lot of my mixes because I like flax. Flax is cheap. It is a plant that is never going to take over a plot, but yet anytime we put flax in a mix, it's almost always there. So it's not overly competitive, but it also does not get crowded out very easily. It's relatively inexpensive seed. It's fairly small seed, and it's fairly, it's a very durable residue. You know, that's a pretty tough stem. There's a lot of lignin in there. This is not something that cattle are going to graze at all, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because sometimes we need something left after the cowboy gets done having the cows in there. You need something left yet. So for that reason, we like flax. It stands well after it freezes out. Like I say, it doesn't have a huge blossom, but it will bloom, and it's got a nice little blue flower, as you can see at different places here. So we'll put it in our pollinator mixes as well. But we use a lot of flax, and again, just a couple pounds an acre is all we normally would do. You don't need a lot of it, but it's a nice plant to have in there. Now, the African cabbage is another type of brassica. It is a little bit like the radish in the fact that when it senses days getting longer, it's going to try to go reproductive. It doesn't go reproductive nearly as fast as the radish. As you can see, this is just kind of starting to bolt and form some blossoms here. Cabbage is pretty distinctive. It almost always has a purplish tinge, particularly down at the base of the stem here. But it's somewhat unique in the brassica family, in that it's going to grow, it's the tallest growing brassica, but it's also the one that will retain its residue the longest. So when these plants would freeze out in the wintertime, radishes and turnips and a lot of those things, they just kind of melt away and there's not much left. These things will, and I've seen cabbage, 4 or 5 feet tall, they'll stand all winter long. They'll hold on to their leaves quite well throughout the winter. So as a snow catching crop, if you put just a little bit of this in a mix and you have these kind of every so often standing up, it's kind of a taller, bushier type plant, they're going to knock some snow down and do pretty good. They do have pretty high protein content, but they're not going to be real palatable for the cattle. They have if you chew some of the leaves, it's got a real kind of a horseradishy taste, and it's pretty high in glucosinolates, which is a chemical compound which gives that bitter, pungent flavor. But it also, when this decomposes in the soil, it releases a cyanide type gas, so it can help control nematodes. So we'll make some mixes with some of these hot mustards. We've got some hot radishes, and we'll use some of this cabbage. And like a potato producer that has a bad nematode problem, he'll let that grow up as big as he can get it. He'll come in and he'll shred it, and then immediately incorporate it with a disc of some sort. And then as those brassicas break down and decompose, they release this cyanide gas, which will kill the nematodes. Now it kills the other biology too, So it's kind of it's not necessarily something you would do unless you had a real severe nematode issue, which a lot of the potato guys do, because potatoes being a root crop are real susceptible to nematodes. So we don't necessarily use it for that, but some of the other properties are a really good fit. One other thing I want to show you in this plot, it's a new, something new that we are looking at this year, and that's, if you see all these plants that have all these little yellow, tiny yellow flowers, these are Medicus, and I've got in 3 different plots, there's 3 different types of Medicus. We've got burr Medicus, barrel Medicus, and then there's snail Medicus down there. The snail Medicus have quite a bit larger seed head or seed pod here. We don't know much about these yet. We're just evaluating these. This is a seed I got in from Australia. But what I've observed so far is they're probably not going to get much bigger than this, because they've bloomed, or they are blooming. They're already setting seed pods, so they're going to be a pretty short duration. This is going to be quite hard seed, so you know, I probably will have volunteer Medicus out here for several years. But it would appear to me that they establish much better in these mixes in this short time frame, much better than clovers. And that's kind of what because we've always kind of been disappointed with spring planted clovers in a mix. They're just slow to get going and don't establish as fast as we'd like. So we're looking at these Medicus to see if they can be affordable enough, if they're going to turn into be a weed issue for us. We don't know. Christine Jones said this is a very staple crop in Australia for grazing sheep on. High protein, and they're one of the few things that will grow well in the winter time. Now their winter time is probably more like our fall. Her part of Australia, they don't get real cold, but she says they graze a lot of sheep on a lot of Medicus. Has anybody in here ever done anything with Medicus or tried Medicus or anything? Know anything about it? You probably know more than I do, because I don't know very much. Okay, well, like I say, it's something that we're looking at. We'll kind of keep you posted if we learn earth-shattering things with these.
What's that seed cost per pound?
I think it's going to be cheaper than clover. The seed size is going to be a little larger than clover. I only got 50-pound bags, so you know, the freight and everything was, I don't have a good feel for seed cost yet. It's going to have to be cheaper than clover to make it work, because it's got larger seed size. That's the cabbage. Got that purple, purplish tint. It just hasn't really started blooming yet. The last ones I want to kind of point out and look at, and then we can kind of, you can wander around and kind of look and ask questions. This really pretty strip here that has all of the, you know, I've got yellow flowers and white flowers and purple flowers and all sorts of different things, blue flowers. This is what we call our cool season pollinator mix. And one of the things that we promote, and some people are doing, is they would plant a strip like this, kind of up along the edge of the field, maybe a strip up through the middle, around a pivot point or something like that. Basically to be a insectiary strip where it will provide habitat for some of these beneficial insects. And if you walk through here, you'll find a lot of ladybugs. There will be some lacewings flying around. A tremendous amount of insect activity right in this area. The theory being is, if we have, say we have corn or soybeans growing in the rest of this field, well, when the aphids come in to attack that, if I don't have a population of ladybugs nearby or other things that would eat aphids, it's going to take a lot longer for me to build up those natural predators to the aphids. And so then by the time my predators get built up, they may have, or the aphids may have caused economic damage to my crop. So the theory here is, if we can provide some habitat and I have a population nearby, these things can increase their populations quite quickly too, just like aphids. But I have to have the starting population somewhere close. So we're trying to evaluate how effective this can be at providing that habitat. This is going to be relatively inexpensive compared to, like I just did, quoted out a CSP, or CSP pollinator mix for a customer, just 1 acre, but it was all the native type pollinators, about $250 an acre. Now that strip will be there in 30 years yet, because those are really good native long-lasting plants, but it's going to take a while to establish and it's quite expensive. You can do something like this for $30 an acre, and then you can move the strip around from year to year wherever you want it. So each one kind of has its own fit, and each one will do something a little bit different. So there is even some other types of flowers in here. There's some buckwheat that buckwheat does not survive any frost, but this stuff must have came up late enough those late April frosts did not take it out.
When was this planted?
April 12th.
How late can you plant?
I mean, you could plant this fairly late. These mustards are going to bloom, you know, all throughout the year. The later that you plant it, I would switch over. I mean, we've got a warm season mix that would have a lot of buckwheat, sunflowers, cowpeas, things like that. So the goal is to get these flowering before your crops would flower or be under attack. So the sooner the better. You would want to plant this, and this is why this is almost all cool season crops, except I threw a little buckwheat in to see what it would do. You know, you would want to get this planted when you have soil temperatures in the low 40s, because this will all come up at that soil temp. And to try to get this flowering population, now ideally right next to it, you would come in when you have 65-degree soil temps and plant a warm season mix that would flower later in the year. So that way those insects always have a source of pollen, always have a source of food. One last plant I want to show you, and then I'll kind of turn you loose to wander around, and that is a plant called Sulla, S-U-L-L-A, and again, it's a clover type plant. This one actually came from Italy. This company from Italy wanted to send me some to try, so I said sure, send it over. And it's, you know, it's this kind of looks like a clover, but it's got really big leaves like that. And again, I don't know much about this plant. Brett had it in his plots down in Oklahoma, and it did quite a bit better than the clovers as far as establishing early and growing faster. We don't know how persistent it's going to be. I don't know how much the seed costs. I don't really know much about it, but you know, we're always trying to try new things. To me, this looks like it did well enough that we'll continue to investigate it. And actually, the guys from Italy are supposed to be coming. They're coming through, and they want to stop in and look at this, you know, later on this year. So stay tuned on that. But that's something that you know, could be a good, you know, nutritious grazing legume as well.